H.P. Lovecraft, Chapter 6, The Tomb Legions. When Dr. Herbert West disappeared a year ago, the Boston police questioned me closely. They suspected that I was holding something back, and perhaps suspected graver things. But I could not tell them the truth, because they would not believe it. They knew indeed that West had been connected with activities beyond the credence of ordinary men, for his hideous experiments in the reanimation of dead bodies had long been too extensive to admit of perfect secrecy. But the final soul-shattering catastrophe held elements of demonic fantasy which make even me doubt the true reality of what I saw. I was West's closest friend and only confidential assistant. We had met years before in medical school, and from the first I had shared his terrible researches. He had slowly tried to perfect a solution which, injected into the veins of the nearly deceased, would restore life. A labor demanding an abundance of rather fresh corpses, and therefore involving the most unnatural actions. Still more shocking were the products of some of the experiments. Grisly masses of flesh that had been dead, but that West had waked to blind, brainless, and nauseous animation. These were the usual results, for in order to reawaken the mind, it was necessary to have specimens so absolutely fresh that not a single decay could possibly affect the delicate brain cells. This need for very fresh corpse had been West's moral undoing. They were hard to get, and one awful day he had secured a specimen while it was still alive, and quite vigorous. A struggle, a needle, and a powerful alkaloid had transformed it to a very fresh corpse. And the experiment succeeded for a brief and memorable moment, but West had emerged with a soul rather calloused and seared, and a hardened eye which sometimes glanced with a kind of hideous and calculating appraisal at men of especially sensitive brain and especially vigorous physique. Toward the last I became acutely afraid of West, for he began to look at me that way. People did not seem to notice his glances, but they noticed my fear, and after his disappearance used that as a basis for some absurd suspicions. West, in reality, was more afraid than I, for his abominable pursuits entailed a life of furtiveness and dread of every shadow. Partly it was the police he feared, but sometimes his nervousness was deeper and more nebulous, touching on certain indescribable things into which he had injected a morbid life, and from which he had not seen that life depart. He usually finished his experiments with a revolver, but a few times he had not been quick enough. There was that first specimen on whose rifled grave marks of clawing were later seen. There was also that Arkham professor's body who had done cannibal things before it had been captured and thrust unidentified into a madhouse cell at Sefton, where it beat the walls for 16 years. Most of the other possible surviving results were things, less easy to speak of. For in later years, West's scientific zeal had degenerated to an unhealthy and fantastic mania, and he had spent his chief skill in vitalization, not entire human bodies, but isolated parts of bodies, or parts joined to organic matter other than human. It had become fiendishly disgusting by the time he disappeared. Many of the experiments could not even be hinted at in print. The Great War, through which both of us served as surgeons, had intensified this sight of West. In saying that West's fear of a specimen was nebulous, I have in mind particularly its complex nature. Part of it came merely from knowing of the existence of such nameless monsters, while another part arose from apprehensions of the bodily harm they might under certain circumstances do him. Their disappearance added horror to the situation. Of them all, West knew the whereabouts of only one, that pitiful asylum thing. Then there was a more subtle fear, a very fantastic sensation, resulting from a curious experiment of the Canadian Army in 1915. West, in the midst of a severe battle, had reanimated Major Sir Eric Moreland Chapman, D.S.O., a fellow physician who knew about his experiments, and could have duplicated them. The head had been removed, so that the possibilities of quasi-intelligence life in the trunk might be investigated. Just as the building was wiped out by a German shell, there had been a success. The trunk had moved intelligently, and, unbelievable to relate, we were both strikingly sure the articulate sounds had come from the detached head as it lay in a shadowy corner of the laboratory. This shell had been merciful in a way, but West could never feel as certain as he wished that we too were the only survivors. He used to make shuddering conjecture about the possible actions of a headless physician with the power of reanimating the dead. West's last quarters were in a venerable house of much elegance, overlooking one of the oldest burying grounds in Boston. He had chosen the place for purely symbolic and fantastically aesthetic reasons. Most of the interments were of the colonial period, and therefore of little use at all to a scientist seeking very fresh bodies. The laboratory was in a subcellar, secretly constructed by imported workmen, and contained a huge incinerator for the quiet and complete disposal of such bodies, or fragments and synthetic mockeries of bodies, as might remain from the morbid experiments and unhallowed amusement of the owner. During the excavation of his cellar, the workmen had struck some exceedingly ancient masonry, undoubtedly connected with this old burying ground, yet far too deep to correspond with any known sepulchre therein. Under a number of calculations, West decided that it represented some secret chamber beneath the tomb of the Averils, where the last interment had been made in 1768. I was with him when we studied the nitrous-dripping walls, laid bare by the spades and mattocks of the men, and was prepared for the gruesome thrill which would attend the uncovering of century grave secrets. But for the first time West's new timidity conquered his natural curiosity, and he betrayed his degenerate fibre by ordering the masonry left intact and plastered over. Thus it remained till the final hellish night, part of the walls of the secret laboratory. I speak of West's decadence, but must add that it was purely mental and intelligible thing. Outwardly he was the same to the last, calm, cold, slight, yellow-haired, spectacled, blue eyes, and a general aspect of youth which years and fears never did seem to change. He seemed calm enough when he thought of that clawed grave, and looked over his shoulder, even when he thought of the carnivorous things that gnawed and pawed at Sefton bars. The end of Herbert West began one evening in our joint study, when he was dividing his curious glance between the newspaper and me. A strange headline item had struck at him from the crumpled pages, and a nameless tightened claw had seemed to reach down through 16 years. Something fearsome and incredible had happened at Sefton Asylum, 50 miles away, stunning the neighborhood and baffling the police. In the small hours of the morning, a body of silent men had entered the grounds, and their leader had aroused the attendants. He was a menacing military figure who talked about without moving his lips, and whose voice seemed almost ventriloquially connected with an immense black case he carried. His expressionless face was handsome to the point of radiant beauty, but had shocked the superintendent when the high light had fell on it, for it was a wax face with eyes of painted glass. Some nameless accident must have befallen this man. A larger man guided his steps, a repellent hunk whose bluish face seemed half eaten away by some unknown malady. The speaker had asked for the custody of the cannibal monster committed from Arkham 16 years before, and upon being refused, gave a signal which precipitated a shocking riot. The fiends had beaten, trampled, and bitten every attendant who had not fled, killing 4, and finally succeeding in the liberation of the monster. Those victims who could recall the event without hysteria swore that the creatures had acted less like men than like unthinkable automata guided by the wax-faced leader. By the time help could be summoned, every trace of the men and of their mad charge had simply vanished. From the hour of reading this item until midnight, West sat almost paralyzed. At midnight the doorbell rang. This startled him fearfully. All the servants were asleep in the attic, so I answered the bell. As I have told the police, there was no wagon in the street, but only a group of strange-looking figures bearing a large square box which they deposited in the hallway. After one of them had grunted in a highly unnatural voice, "Express, prepaid," they filed out of the house with a jerky tread, and as I watched them go, I had an odd idea that they were turning toward the ancient cemetery on which the back of the house abutted. When I slammed the door after them, West came downstairs. and looked at the box. It was about 2 feet square, and bore West's correct name and his present address. It also bore the inscription, "From Eric Borland Chaplain Lee, St. Illo, Flanders." 6 years before, in Flanders, a shelled hospital had fallen upon the headless reanimated trunk of Dr. Chapman Lee, and upon the detached head which, perhaps, had uttered the articulated sounds. West was not even excited now. His condition was more ghastly, and quickly he said, "It's the finish. But let's incinerate this." He carried the thing down to the laboratory, listening. I do not remember many particulars. You can imagine my state of mind, but it is a vicious lie to say it was Herbert West's body which I put into the incinerator. We both inserted the whole unopened wooden box, closed the door, and started the electricity. Nor did any sound come from the box after all. It was West who first noticed the falling plaster on the part of the wall where the ancient tomb masonry had been covered up. I was going to run, but he stopped me. Then I saw a small black aperture, felt a ghoulish wind of ice, and smelled the charnel bowels of putrescent earth. There was no sound, but just then the electric lights went out, and I saw outlined against some phosphorescence of the netherworld a horde of silent, toiling things, which only insanity or worse could create. Their outlines were definitely human, or semi-human, fractionally human, and not human at all. The horde was grotesquely heterogeneous. They were removing the stones quietly, one by one from the censured wall, and then, as the breach became large enough, they came into the laboratory in single file, led by a stalking thing with a beautiful head made of wax. A sort of mad-eyed monstrosity behind the leader seized on Herbert West. West did not resist, or utter a sound. Then they all sprang at him, and tore him to pieces before my eyes, bearing the fragments away into the subterranean vault of fabulous abominations. West's head was carried off by the wax-headed leader, who wore a Canadian officer's uniform. Sorry. As it disappeared, I saw that the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. Servants found me uncautious in the morning. West was gone. The incinerator contained only unidentifiable ashes. Detectives have questioned me. But what can I say? The Sefton tragedy they will not connect with West. Not that, nor the men with the box, whose existence that they deny. I told them of the vault, and they pointed to the unbroken plaster wall and laughed. So I told them no more. They imply that I am a madman, or possibly the murderer. Maybe I am mad, but I might not be mad if those accursed tomb legions had not been so silent.